Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our first of our series of webinar topics as part of the RSK Power On campaign. So my name is Becky O'Shea. I'm one of the Associate Directors at Copper Consultancy, and as I said, this is the first of our webinars to look at, the aim of the series is to look at key opportunities during the energy development project's lifecycle. To power forward renewable projects and progress the energy transition. You can find out more details and upcoming webinar events on our website, and we'll share some details at the end of this as well. So this first of our webinars, and thank you for joining us, is about how to prepare your projects for a general election and the next government. So I'll run you through some quick things at the start and some housekeeping, then I'll introduce you to our panelists, and then you can ask some questions. So in terms of the context of the polls, obviously part of our role at Copper is we look very closely at election patterns and what's happening in politics. Latest YouGov polling taken on 15th and 16th of May is Conservatives were at 20% and Labour at 47%. So that is indicating, plus the by-election results recently is showing a Labour majority and quite a sizable Labour majority. So we do need to be preparing, I think, for a change of government. There is a lot of speculation at the moment about when the general election will be. We know it has to be this year. We're not seeing any indications of a snap election. So we're looking at the latter part of this year, really. That's where we think the election is going to be taking place. So part of this is how do you prepare for that, and what do projects need to be doing to help prepare for an election. Are we onto the housekeeping slides? Yes. So in terms of housekeeping, so how we'll run today is you'll notice that your microphones are off. That's just to help us manage the event more smoothly. So you'll be muted throughout this webinar. You can pose your questions in a question box. I think you'll probably see an example in there at the moment. So you won't see the questions that are coming through, but that's just an example of the types of questions you might want to ask, just as a prompter. We'll start with a bit of a discussion with some of our panelists, and then pop your questions into the questions box, and myself and one of the facilitators will try to get through those through the course of this panel event. We'll try to get through everything. We can't necessarily do it in an hour, but hopefully we'll have a really interesting debate over the course of this next hour. So thank you, and I think we can move to introducing the panelists. So Patrick from Copper, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi Becky, hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. So Patrick Trainer, Associate Director at Copper and leading on our public affairs activity. For those who don't know, Copper, we are a communications agency specialising in all things infrastructure, and we are part of the RSK Group. Over to you, Adam.
Hi, thank you, Patrick, and thanks, Becky, for moderating today's session. My name's Adam Izamal. I work for RWE, and my role is the Head of Offshore Development for UK East. So I look after all of the offshore projects that RWE has in the early stages right through to financial investment decision. I've worked in the energy sector my entire career, which depressingly is ticking up towards 19 years, and exclusively in offshore wind since 2012. Derek.
Hi, thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Derek Hastings. I'm the Director of Onshore Projects at Butte Energy. So I've been primarily focusing for the past year or so on the Welsh wind industry, battery and solar. Previously, I've worked for SSE and worked for Scottish Power. So I've worked in hydro refurb, various thermal plants, including energy from waste, carbon capture and storage, battery, solar and wind. Both from a development and construction perspective. So I've been in the power industry for over 30 years now, although obviously I don't look it.
Thank Thank you, everyone. So I think as an opening question, a good place to start would be, how can developers best navigate the uncertainty surrounding potential changes in government policy and planning for energy projects? Adam, if we can start with you on that one.
Thanks, Becky. Right, I mean, I think from an offshore perspective, we don't see a huge difference in policy between the two major parties, both very committed to offshore wind. A cynic might say that the Labour targets are even more fantastical than the Conservatives. But we've actually benefited from a pretty stable policy platform for at least the last 10 years, and the introduction of the contracts for difference. Now, going forward, I guess the major uncertainty is how quickly Labour will want to pursue offshore wind, and that may mean that, for example, we might see more generous allocations in the contracts for difference starting from AR7, but we may also see some strings attached to that, and by that I mean the sustainable industry rewards policies being strengthened, so that there will be, more or stronger commitments towards developing supply chain in the UK. But broadly speaking, there isn't a huge amount of uncertainty. But that said, the offshore industry isn't in a fantastic place at the moment. Since the Ukraine crisis, we have been experiencing extremely high inflation of our cost base, and of course, increased cost of capital, which has meant that the cost of our projects has increased pretty dramatically. And I think we are struggling, whether it's with Labour or the Conservatives, to really make sure that politicians and policymakers understand what's happened, and that the days of an ever decreasing cost of energy from renewables projects and renewables projects offshore are unfortunately a thing of the past, and we need to adapt to that, to the new normal we're now living in.
Derek, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point Adam's called out. I think there's been quite a lot of certainty about offshore for a period of time, and a reasonable alignment by any of the parties. I think the onshore situation is slightly more complicated, because we have areas where people are relatively keen on onshore and areas where they're not so much. So we've seen really in the past number of years very little happening in England, for example. There's land available and so on. The policy has been to leave it to locals to say effectively no. So disappointingly little has been done in England. Lots have been done in Scotland, and Wales is beginning to pick up, and more is beginning to happen in Wales. One of the big challenges, of course, has been the paucity of grid. So we know we need three primary things to make any of our projects work. We have to have the consent, we have to have the land, we have to have the grid. Now, the land is there, it's available as it is, but we've got to have the planning in place, and we've got to have the grid availability as well, and the grid takes some time to develop. So because we've had a policy for decades now, really, I suppose, of waiting for things to happen before you build the grid, it means you've got that lag. So I think the other thing I'd add to it really is that 2030 is not very far. It's not a long time away. So here we're now getting really, really close to June 2024. 2030 is effectively one project cycle away, if we think of how long it takes to typically do what we have to do to develop an onshore project. And onshore projects are still the quickest and cheapest way of delivering what we need to do from a net zero perspective.
Thank you, Derek. And then Patrick, anything to add from the corporate perspective on that one?
Yeah, I think from a copper perspective and focusing on kind of a practical side of things in terms of what developers can do to navigate the uncertainty, I think the key is engagement. So there's a few things really that spring to mind. Number one is kind of making sure as a developer you're familiar with kind of what both Labour and Conservatives have set out in terms of policy, and that you're starting to feed into those conversations. So Labour have announced a lot of kind of top line and top level policies, but the real details that go beyond the manifesto will still be being worked out by their team of advisors and by members of the shadow cabinet. So engaging with those people, I think, is absolutely critical. Likewise, kind of going to more kind of granular and local level, making sure people are engaging with parliamentary candidates, especially in seats in UK, Wales and Scotland, where it looks like there's a likelihood of political change, where you could see Conservative MP being ousted and Labour MP coming in, making sure you're having those conversations, especially if you've got kind of important projects in their patch. I think one of the things that we find is we have a lot of projects where the lifespan of the project goes beyond Parliament. So you will have kind of, they'll begin life under one MP and they'll end life under another one, and potentially you could have another MP in between if you end up with kind of by-elections and people stepping down. So that kind of constant engagement at a local level with parliamentary candidates about projects, and then engaging at a national level with the front bench and trying to kind of influence and shape policy, I think, are the two key tips really in the build-up to an election.
Interesting, thank you. I think do sort of pop some questions in there into the chat if you think of them, but otherwise we'll carry on. And so we're just thinking in terms of policy and planning uncertainty, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the energy sector? I don't know if put that to Adam or Derek first of all.
Yeah, I think the biggest I think from an offshore perspective, the two primary challenges we're facing at the moment are the grid. The grid, we have not invested enough as a nation in grid for far too long, and we're now in the very unfortunate position of having to play catch up in a quite unprecedented way. Those of you on the webinar who have seen the ESO's plans for future infrastructure, for those of you, it will not be lost the enormity of the task in hand. There are overhead lines due to be built, 400 kV overhead lines, spanning actually as far from Peterhead to northwest England, from East Anglia into London. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that needs to be built in a remarkably short period of time. I mean, Derek's mentioned 2030 and 2030 not being far away. Actually, the scale of the projects that National Grid have to deliver to make the grid ready to receive the renewables projects that are already in planning is actually greater than the projects themselves, than the renewables projects themselves. So it is a huge challenge. We've as a nation, because we haven't done this for a long time, the skills and resources aren't there. So I have actually a great deal of sympathy for our colleagues at both NGET and the ESO. And you know, allied to that is actually quite a lot of new technology in terms of the installation of subsea interconnectors between the north of Scotland and eastern England, which all need to be delivered to make sure that the power generation, which is principally focused in the north of the UK, can get to the principal demand centres in the southeast. So grid is a huge issue. As I alluded to earlier, the CFD support scheme for offshore also needs to be sorted out relatively quickly. Now, I think with offshore wind and probably onshore to a certain extent, the technology is so mature now that principally deployment is an economic problem now. Unfortunately, we have seen two very, very unfortunate recent allocation rounds in the CFD. So AR4, to a certain extent, understandable because it happened at the same time as the Ukraine crisis. So it was very difficult for policymakers and government to respond to that. But then the AR5 resulting in 0 offshore wind megawatts coming through was very, very regrettable. And I'm afraid to say we're expecting maybe not 0, but certainly 25 to 30% of the eligible projects for AR6 to come to fruition. So we really need policymakers, and we need to make our case better, I think, as an industry, that we are a cheap and stable form of energy generation with high levels of energy security, and the commitment needs to be there through the contracts for different scheme, which has been hugely successful to make it work, but it has to be at economically sustainable levels.
So in terms of government and Labour both committed to, so they're committed to tackling grid issues, speeding up planning process. What would you like to see them do in this area?
I think what we would like to see is some certainty regarding, you know, when these projects are going to be achieved. And right now, very unfortunately, we're in a position of really not being able to trust the offers that Grid make to us, because we see the enormity of the challenge that they have now. An awful lot of grid connection agreements and grid connection offers have the 2030 date in them, or 2029, because that's been historically the target. You know, we'd rather know now rather than later if there are going to be delays, you know, to the building of that infrastructure. As to what government can do, well, you know, they've set up the future system operator. Time will tell whether that's you know, an initiative that's gonna bear fruit. I think fundamentally understanding the enormity of the task and helping the ESO and National Grid achieving it through quick planning decisions and any other support that National Grid require from them. I would warmly welcome that.
Derek, anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, I would agree with the point about the planning 100%. This has got to be such a challenge because, of course, we have a situation where energy policy is controlled in Westminster, but planning is held within devolved areas very often as well. So we may have a disconnect between what the aspiration is in Westminster and what the Senate want to do in Cardiff, or what the Scottish Parliament want to do in Edinburgh. So there's a bit of a disconnect, or there can be a disconnect between those two. Even if they're minded to do it, again, because of the huge number of projects coming forwards, then there's a challenge getting resource. So we think of the push we've had in recent years for STEM subjects to be studied, but of course it's across the entire value chain what we're looking at. We need more engineers, we need more people who can do planning, we need more environmentalists, and these needs will continue to grow. So having quicker planning decisions, ones which are more logical, and in some countries in Europe, for example, when something is pre-approved, if you meet the criteria, you'll get permission. So can you put a kind of sensible position in place where you've demonstrated, yes, we've met all of that, and it should be a fairly, not easy, but it should be a straightforward process of, yes, we can demonstrate we have done all of these things. That type of arrangement would be hugely useful. And as has been said, I mean, I think with grid, if you go for a grid connection for an onshore project, be it solar or be it wind, if you haven't already got tech, the chances are you'll be quoted 2035, 2037. That's a long way away. And you know, that in itself presents huge problems to maintain that. So I think with all of those things, there's a lot of challenges, but as has been said, I think really there's a lot of opportunities as well, because in terms of if you want to work in an exciting industry and take these things head on, there's never been a better time or more exciting time to do it. But really, we've got to get people into the industry and create the jobs and create the work that everybody thinks is a good thing to do.
Sorry, Becky, I think you might be on mute.
There's a lot of feedback on my thing. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Patrick. So in Scotland, it's less of a bipartisan situation, with the SNP meaning three major parties fighting for seats, with renewables and grid and their future being heavily based in Scotland. Do you see SNP Labour collaboration to get projects running in Scotland?
Well, I think it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, whether we're looking in Scotland or we're working with Plaid and Labour in Wales, we end up with the same sort of situations where political parties will collaborate when there's a mutual advantage, when they think there's a point. So I think later on we may well talk about how we prepare, but it's really quite important that we help demonstrate that what we're doing, it's net zero for everybody. There's a net benefit for everybody. So irrespective of which political affiliation you have, we all need to address climate change. We all need to do what we're doing. So in some circumstances, it might be more straightforward, but it doesn't mean it's easy. I've seen circumstances in Scotland where you have an SNP government and an SNP council, and the council say, no, we don't want that project. The planning department say, no, we're not interested. We're kind of recommending you don't do it. And it's still up to the minister to decide whether to do it or not. So irrespective of whether it's one party, two or three, I think it probably gets exponentially more difficult the more parties you put into the position. But just because you've got the same UK government and the same devolved party government, it doesn't necessarily make it as easy as you would like it to be.
I think just to build on that as well from Derek, we might actually see that situation that Derek's just described in Wales, where for the first time in kind of over a decade, we're probably likely to see a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour government in Wales at the same time. So it will be interesting to see when that actually happens, whether that does lead to kind of more joined up thinking, whether there's any kind of planning reforms. Obviously, Wales have got a slightly different kind of planning system in place, whether they look to align things more with Westminster, and whether kind of initiatives like the Celtic Sea, which will be kind of at the heart of kind of what Labour are trying to do, whether they get a bit more kind of backing and a bit more joined up thinking. So it could be quite an interesting dynamic in kind of Wales and England following the election as well.
I think with regards to the SNP, Becky, the point I would make to them is, that they're very proud of their ScotWind leasing round, which was, the first thing they did after the devolution of the Crown Estate to Crown Estate Scotland. Really, for that to be a success, they have a very healthy self-interest in making sure that projects further south get away as quickly as possible, because the way that the grid is charged means that in a competitive auction scenario, Scottish projects will always tend to be at the back of the queue. So I think they recognise that, and I think for that reason, and for the broader reason, as Derek says, that net zero is bigger than these political issues between constituent nations of the UK. That there will be a lot of cooperation actually between SNP and Labour in the event of a Labour government, or at least a lot of support. Now, of course, how much leverage the SNP has, of course, depends on the size of the majority that the Labour Party get. But it could be a very interesting scenario if Labour falls just short or has a very small majority, which I guess isn't out of the question as things stand.
Yeah, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to come on to sort of any predictions about majorities or stuff, or that's sort of getting into the arts of what may be.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a bit of a poison chalice question, isn't it, to make predictions on a webinar? But I think what we can say is, if you look at kind of where the polling is going, and as you alluded to at the start, the recent by-election results in the local elections, kind of all roads do point to a Labour majority at this point, and that includes Labour performing well kind of on the ground in Scotland, in Wales, in England, all at the same time, really. The big caveat being things can change overnight, and we've seen it kind of historically with elections where kind of people go into them with a big lead, and then kind of one incident or kind of one set of policies can actually quickly change opinion. The example I'd go back to is Theresa May when she called a general election. Again, she did so because she thought she was going to kind of be returned with a really large majority, and then the election kind of got dominated by one policy about social care that kind of prior to the election no one had talked about, and then that became the policy in the backdrop of the entire election. So things can change quickly in politics. So I think it is, going back to kind of the engagement point, it is worth continuing still to speak to all parties, kind of to monitor what they're saying, and to plan for a Labour majority, but also kind of be prepared for something that isn't a Labour majority as well, just in case.
Thank you. So I think that leads nicely into the next question, which says, so Labour has some ambitious policies and commitments as part of its Make Its Britain a Clean Energy Superpower mission. So as developers, is carbon zero electricity by 2030 achievable? What do you think needs to happen to get close to meeting that target? And Great British Energy is Labour's flagship policy. How will this impact the sector? So this is more about, if Labour do get in, how do we meet what Labour are saying? Don't know if who wants to take that first.
Do you want me to go first in terms of from a Labour policy view, and then we can hear from kind of Adam and Derek from a kind of developer point of view. So the 2030 target, I think from the people that I've spoken to, I think a lot of people think it's going to be kind of it's very much a stretch target and an ambitious target to work towards. Quite difficult actually for Labour to meet, even with kind of level of reforms that they put forward. Great British Energy is their flagship policy, and it's something that a lot of clients have kind of asked me about in terms of kind of what is Great British Energy, how does it work, kind of what's its remit, will it compete with the private sector, will it help? Whenever I speak to Labour and whether I've heard Labour speak about Great British Energy, they describe it as kind of a catalyst for investment and something that works in partnership with the private sector. So it might be taking stakes in strategic projects that potentially the private sector might not want to do kind of on its own. It might be kind of investing in projects that are designed to kind of support strategic growth, but it's designed to kind of sit alongside the private sector and not to compete. So in an ideal world, kind of Great British Energy will come in and unlock certain things and certain projects that allow kind of the whole system to work together to get to kind of 2030 or 2035 targets. That is kind of what Labour have set out. Obviously, kind of Labour have also watered down some of the funding that goes with their kind of energy projects, in particularly kind of their kind of green investment plan. I think it's £21 billion originally pledged has been watered down. So there is a question mark around kind of levels of investment and what can be done. But at the same time, kind of a point that's been made on this panel already, policy certainty is what people are after. And that is something that Labour can offer, even without kind of substantial investment. They can offer certainty for the next kind of 5 years in terms of what the policy is and what kind of the ground rules will be. So that'd be my kind of view on that.
I mean, the answer to the question, will the electricity system be decarbonised by 2030 is no, it will not be. 2035 even looks like, I mean, Patrick used the word stretch target. I mean, 2035 looks extremely ambitious. You know, as I said earlier, the technology is there, right? The technology is there. We know how to build, gigawatt scale offshore wind farms. Where it isn't there is in terms of grid and storage solutions, but developments are being made pretty rapidly on certainly on the storage front. And actually, it's pretty uncommon these days actually to see an onshore wind farm being developed without co-located batteries, for example. But let's be fair, we're still quite a way off that. What are we? I guess what are we doing about, or what do we think as the UK's largest generator of electricity and the one with the biggest renewables pipeline? What does RWE think about Great British Energy? I think our position at the moment is we cautiously welcome it, cautiously because there is an awful lot of detail which needs to be put on the bones of the proposal. So we still don't really know if it's Great British Energy will be a partner or indeed a competitor of ours. So there's a lot of work that Labour need to do before we really understand what Great British Energy is. Is it a co-investor? Is it a generator? Is it more on the retail side? Is it a supplier of last resort? We simply don't yet know. It might be a combination of all of the above. It might be tailored to one part of that. So we are engaging with Labour at the moment. I mean, one thing I'm very keen on is that when they come into office, if they come into office, they are already aware of the challenges the sector faces. So they don't spend too much time having to understand what the problems are. And I think we have right now an advantage because without wishing to cast aspersions on the civil service, they have their ideas about how to grow the sector and how to decarbonise, and we want to get in there first. We want to make sure we're shaping the narrative of Labour politicians before they come into power.
Yeah, I think what I'd add to what Adam's spoken about is that it's very difficult to say what the Labour approach will mean. Because it's not very clear what it means at the moment. The aspirations are laudable. I think we can all buy into what they're trying to do, but I was looking earlier on when we discussed this at the priorities that are called out, and I've called out number 1, develop economic stability, 2, cut NHS waiting times, 3, launch a new border security command, and 4, set up Great British Energy. So they've got a heck of a lot to do. And I would like to see these things happen, but they're talking about 500,000 new jobs or 650,000 jobs is a huge situation. Whether it's from a kind of private company perspective, friend or foe, who can say? An analogue might be what was called
Sorry, Becky, I think we've lost Derek's sound.
I was just going to check as well. Yeah, I can't hear him either. Sorry, Derek. Can we just bear with us a moment? We'll just check Derek's sound. Derek, can you hear us? Nod if you can hear us. I'm not sure. Just bear with us a moment. Yeah, looks like he's resetting. Derek, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, we can't hear Derek at the moment, so just bear with us a moment. And we'll just sort out Derek's sound issues. Patrick, I don't know if you had anything else just while we're sorting Derek's sound issues out.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be interesting is kind of what does a Labour government do kind of when it first comes into power. So they've talked about Labour would bring forward what they call an energy kind of independence bill or energy independence act within the first parliament. So that would look to be kind of the legislative framework for a lot of what Labour is setting out to try and achieve. So that would be something we would keep an eye on, and that is where we might see more of the detail. I agree completely with Adam in terms of Great British Energy. It's unclear exactly what it's meant to be at the moment, and sometimes you hear Labour politicians speak about it and they talk about it as if it's almost kind of a retail energy company that's going to come in and sell energy to people, whereas often when you have kind of more detailed conversations, they position it as kind of the investor in projects and something that takes that strategic stake in projects. So I think a bit of clarity is missing, and hopefully that would come kind of quite early into a Labour government. I think the other point as well is a lot of this detail is not the type of stuff you would include in a public facing manifesto. Manifestos are naturally kind of quite light touch and trying to kind of appeal to a wider audience, not people who work in the energy sector. So I think that'd be the key from me, really, is what detail will come forward from a Labour government, kind of what are the vehicles to introduce some of the things that have been talked about, and that will be where we kind of start to learn more. But it's crucial to kind of engage now rather than kind of after an election. I don't know, Adam, if you've got anything to add to that.
I mean, I guess the point I would make to anybody working in the sector at the moment is, our fortunes are very bound up with policy, right? So policy is extremely, the politics is extremely important to us. We're energy, you can't get away from the fact that it is a highly political issue, and we work in a very highly regulated industry. Now, despite my youthful good looks, I'm actually 41 years old. There has only been a change of government twice in my lifetime, right? This, if it happens, will be the third time. That presents a huge opportunity. We've got a party coming into power potentially, which is looking for ideas. We know that the shadow treasury team at Labour are looking for ideas which will help them meet net zero targets, stimulate the economy at very low cost to the taxpayer. Now, okay, maybe I'm biased, but I would say that investment in it by the bill payer through the CFD auction system into renewables is you get a lot of bang for your buck by doing that. I think the other aspect is, and we talk about a lot of the uncertainty of the who's going to win the general election, but for the last at least 18 months, we've been talking to an administration which is frankly just tired and out of ideas and not up for governing anymore. And I think it's actually a real big opportunity for our sector. you know, we've got, well, as Becky said at the intro, we've got probably a few months, and you know, I think there's a great opportunity to engage with a potential incoming administration in a way that's actually going to make a big difference. I mean, actually, when the coalition came into power in 2010, you know, they birthed the CFD very quickly, and that was, you know, nobody can look back and say that wasn't game changing and a good thing for our industry. So I think we've got an opportunity to influence things going forward, and hopefully we as an industry are going to make the most of that opportunity. Derek, I think I've got you back now, Derek.
Yeah, can we just check that you're working, Derek?
Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, yeah. Lovely.
Splendid. What was the question?
I don't know where we lost you at actually, Derek. So I don't know if there's anything on that point.
Still in the first 100 days or that kind of.
It was about I think you were talking about Great British Energy and the uncertainty associated with that, and us not knowing what it means.
Yeah, I think with Great British Energy, I don't know if it's going to be a friend or foe in terms of a development perspective from a kind of non-public company. But I think a good example is probably what's happening in Wales with what was the renewable energy developer, now Tryden Gwyrddion Cymru, where it's a Welsh government development organisation. One of the challenges they've had, as I was saying, was that they've had difficulty getting people. They're looking for the same resource we're looking for, everybody's looking for. They're looking for the same consultants we're all looking for, and there's a limit to how many times we can raid the same larder and expect to find that. So people is always going to be an issue, but I think what we are seeing is signs of mutual development, because right now, if, for example, I think if we work in the premise that Great British Energy wants the same things we all want, then there's a big enough market for everybody to do what they have to do, because no single organisation can provide everything we need. No single source of energy can provide everything we need right now, and certainly not by 2030. I think I heard Adam say that 2030 it's not going to happen. Well, I think in reality that's realistic. It's not realistic to assume that we can achieve everything that's been suggested for 2030. I think we've got to aim high. We've got to aim, and hopefully we'll overshoot what you might have achieved otherwise. But we've got to keep the pressure down. It's really, really important to keep that pressure all the time, pushing and pushing and pushing.
Sorry, I have to keep going on mute because I've got a bit of background noise, I think, when I'm not on microphone. So we've got a question in here from Peter, who has said he's from the RTPI Consultancy of the Year 2024. He's made a point of putting that into his question. So Lighthouse Development Consulting. He's asking, assuming Labour win, they've talked about a national energy company delivering renewable energy projects. Is there an opinion on what this might look like, how it may impact the way renewable energy schemes are currently delivered, or would they just buy projects?
I think, Becky, just to take that one, I think that obviously is referring to Great British Energy, which we've just kind of talked about. And it's the same answer we kind of just gave. Like, we just don't know yet whether that they are going to develop, or whether it will just be. I personally, if I was kind of betting on this, I'd probably kind of be leaning towards the second, that they will just be taking partnerships with the private sector to begin with, especially within kind of the first Parliament of Labour. Maybe it will grow into something, but yeah, I don't think there's anything else to add on that, unless kind of Adam or Derek.
Yeah, well, let's just take the assumption that you're right, Patrick, and that's what it is. I think we would welcome that, because then nobody will be under any illusions, or can say they're under any illusion, just with any credibility, as to the challenges that we're facing. If you're in, I'd rather, without being too crude, I'd rather them inside the tent rather than outside, if you know what I mean. And if Great British Energy is the vehicle for doing that, then I think we're cool with that.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, actually, the amount of capital involved will be incredible. So we spoke earlier, I think, Adam, you mentioned the point about the rising costs, the cost increases, raw materials. the cost of capital. These are real. As things settle down, we may well see some normalisation. I think there's some signs of normalisation in commodity prices, and that kind of saving has been sort of passed on as well. But there's still an awful lot to do. So yeah, having a strong voice. I think one thing we have to remember is that we, with a UK-centric, and I'm not speaking for Adam because obviously RWE is a massive international player, but in a UK context, I think sometimes in the UK we forget that we are no longer the biggest energy market. We've never really been the biggest energy market. We may have been one of the biggest players in offshore wind and other things, but we've now got to compete with the rest of the world. So the more the UK is doing, the more significant it makes the UK, and the more suppliers will turn their attention to serving the UK and servicing the UK. So again, the more a unified voice with the government of the day would be a hugely useful thing.
And then we've got a question about solar. So solar is now big. We need solar, and large solar and NZIPs have arrived. What's the political position long term regarding solar, nuclear and wind? I don't know what we talk about long-term political position when there might be a change, but yeah, where do you think we sit? I think Patrick, maybe you initially on just what we think of the long-term government ambitions would be and how that would change, because actually I think we've done a lot of analysis, haven't we, on
taking solar first. I think solar's had kind of quite a difficult life recently, in particular during kind of the Liz Truss administration and kind of the Conservative leadership elections that she was part of. There is a element within the Conservative Party that continues to oppose solar and actually sees it as kind of a big election issues, and there's lots of arguments that kind of anyone who works in the solar sector will have come across around kind of the impact on rural areas, on kind of the land usage debate around kind of farming and solar, and lots of different arguments anyway that are put forward by critics of solar. What I would say is that Labour are much more supportive on the whole of solar. So I think in terms of the long-term future, Labour seem to me to be fairly technology agnostic in terms of if it's a clean technology and it helps them meet their 2030 target or get near it, as we've discussed, then I think they will support it. And that applies for onshore wind, obviously, which we've not seen in England, but Labour kind of are committed to bringing back. And then also the offshore sector as well. So be keen to hear kind of Adam and Derek's thought on that. Nuclear is also one that is kind of talked a bit about. It's very popular with kind of the Labour Party unions because it kind of provides kind of jobs in kind of large quantities and large unionised number of jobs. So Labour will always be under pressure from their kind of unions to back nuclear, and they obviously have large kind of sway within the party. Labour is committed to kind of getting Sizewell over the line and Hinkley as well, and they are also looking at kind of new nuclear technologies such as SMR, which we might see kind of rolled out. Again, I think kind of both parties are. I don't think there's too much difference on nuclear or on offshore wind. I think onshore wind, there's a difference where it might come back in England, and solar, I think Labour is more positive to kind of sum up. But really keen to hear kind of Derek and Adam's views as developers.
Yeah, happy to talk about that for a sec. I mean, the land use debate, I think, is number one, Patrick, at the point where it seems to be a real hot spot. I mean, obviously, solar needs grid as well as everything else needs grid. So if we put the grid challenge to one side, then do you use that available land for farming? Do you use it for solar? What do you do? And again, I think sometimes as an industry, we have not always been good at promoting the overall environmental benefits of what we're doing from a biodiversity net gain perspective. We know that some solar farms are laid out in such a way that they can be very good for bees and insects and other things. There's remarkable things in that space to be done. But again, visually, they can be unpopular. So in Wales, I think I would say that the consent for wind is probably more kind of favourable than for solar. We've seen that kind of history. As you mentioned, nuclear. I think nuclear, again, in many areas where it has been around, is popular. It does bring quite a lot of jobs. It's long-term jobs. But in other areas, it's not popular. So nuclear can also cause a schism in between Westminster and devolved governments, and certainly would do in Scotland if they tried to impose that there. I think one thing we have to really plug into this is the energy storage part into the discussion. So we've got a lot of battery projects being planned, a lot of the battery projects in key spaces. I think there's a risk we'll have an overbuild of battery, and some of these projects might effectively cannibalise each other. But we're dealing with a situation where for quite some time now, National Grid's had a strategy of interconnecting across Europe and interconnecting everywhere. And that's been the strategy for energy security. But of course, the situation in Ukraine and the issue we had with the French nuclear reactors going offline and the other issues across Europe demonstrated you have to generate yourself. But having an ability to store energy is critical. So some tariff mechanism or something to support long duration energy storage will also be quite necessary to do that. So we've got that ability. So if we have that kind of ability to have wind, solar, battery working together in an energy park, then that's got to be quite a good thing to do if there's a mechanism for making that cost effective. I think possibly Adam made the point earlier on, these are economic problems, they're not actually technical problems. We have the technology to solve many of the issues we have, but we've got to find ways of actually making them economically viable.
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add on the policy differences on the technology. Just something to throw in there on the grid is I've got a bit of sympathy actually with recent energy ministers. You can think of Graham Stewart maybe, or even Andrew Bowie, whose constituencies are very affected by National Grid's plans. So they have in their own constituencies, in addition to their parliamentary or their ministerial responsibilities, very vocal, very powerful anti-grid groups. Now, if the election goes the way that polls are suggesting, that's and I should say also they're also very powerful backbench colleagues of theirs who have the same in their constituencies. If the election goes as the polls suggest, that dynamic is less likely to be an issue because typically the rural constituencies will continue to be represented by Conservative members of Parliament. So that the leverage that these anti-pylon groups have may diminish substantially. Now, whether that makes a significant difference to the speed at which the grid is deployed, I think is up for debate. But I think that could be an interesting shift.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that on the grid projects that we work on. It's very Tory heartland at the moment, I would say, and you've got some very high-profile ministers in those areas that want to be seen to do what their constituents want, but they also have to toe the party line. So it's quite an interesting dynamic that you see in real time, isn't it, with some of these ministers. So I think just to start wrapping things up, maybe, I think we don't have any extra questions. So something to put back to the group is how are your businesses planning for the election? And hard to sum up, but do you have one piece of advice that you could give to our audience about how you are planning for that? So Adam, maybe if you can kick that off.
We as a business are spending a disproportionate amount of time and energy talking with politicians at the moment. And I'm very supportive of that. I think it is a great investment of time. As I said a moment ago, we cannot escape the fact, much as we would like to, that we are in a highly regulated industry, which can be on occasion very politically sensitive. We don't want any incoming administration, whether it's blue or red, to spend its first 100 days in office wondering what, trying to find out what the hell's going on. To be forewarned is to be forearmed, as they say. So we are talking to all political parties, whether it's Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party, Greens, Labour, Conservatives. We're talking to them all, and we're not just talking to the energy departments or spokespeople. We're talking to the leaderships. We're talking to the Treasury teams. We're talking to the business teams. We're talking to the trade teams. We're talking across the board, not only to the potentially elected representatives and ministers, but also to special advisors and the like, whilst maintaining the ongoing dialogue that we would have anyway with the responsible civil servants. So, as I said earlier, it's only the third time in my lifetime that we're expecting a change in government, and we are throwing the kitchen sink at lobbying to make sure that we're shaping the narrative to the greatest extent possible, and hopefully the policy.
Thank you. I think my experience of doing it as well is they do move swiftly. It's one of the things the civil servants do really well is a swift change of government, and all those policy briefings are put in front of those new ministers very, very quickly. So you want to be ahead of that, don't you? Derek, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think so. I totally agree with Adam about the political engagement. We've been attending all of the party conferences. I suppose if we take a step back, if we think about how government works and what we have, we've got the front bench, we've got the back benches, and we've got the opposition. And we don't know where everybody's going to land in those. We know the front benches, the policymakers, the ministers, the people who enact the sort of works. The back bench can be a source of unrest. There can be a bit of noise in the background. They can generate a lot of hassle for you. And the opposition, well, can be, well, the clue's in the name, I suppose. Do they want to see what you're doing or not? I think one thing typifies politics probably in the last 5 to 10 years has been the very rapid churn of ministers, of secretaries of state, all these things. People have changed jobs time after time after time. I mean, there must be the safest job in government must be the guy who does the sign writing on doors or prints business cards or something like that, because day after day it's another person at the scene. So we don't know where people are going to land in all of this mix, and it could be a different person tomorrow. So covering all the bases, we've been very careful to be politically neutral. We're not picking political winners as such. We're trying to get the message across of what we're trying to do. I agree it's a great investment in time. So highlighting really what we're doing overall. I think another thing to bear in mind is that for any individual company, an individual company can be kind of excluded because of partisan interests. And if we as an industry need to be united, so the industry bodies, there's some great work being done by Renewable UK Cymru, by Scottish Renewables, a whole host of organisations who are working very hard. So for the industry to be aligned with the lobbying groups and working together is really, really important to get that unified messaging across. I think at the end of the day, for me, I do not criticise any other form of power. I've worked in many of them, as I mentioned earlier on. We need all of them. So it's not in my interest to knock nuclear or knock offshore or knock whatever. We need all of it, and we need more of it. I think a kind of final thought for me, what is the one piece of advice really? Well, probably number one is don't become a political football. The big risk we have, we don't want what we are doing to become the political football that just causes discord. We want it to be a unifying factor. People say, yeah, we agree with net zero, we agree we've got to improve that. So if we are timing our public consultations or timing other things as best as we can, I mean, obviously we don't know when the election is going to be, we don't quite know how it's going to impact and so on, but we want to try as an industry to not become the football. We want to be part of the solution, but not part of the problem. So keeping that, keep telling people why what we do is so important, why what we do is necessary, and why what we do is actually achievable and real, and just keep pushing that positive message time after time after time.
Patrick, anything to add to that from a more general perspective about how to work with?
Yeah, I think kind of a bit of a broken record here, but engage is kind of the one tip that I'd say, and then kind of in line with kind of what Adam and Derek have said, kind of take every opportunity to engage. But I think I'd add to that by saying, like, try and kind of do so in a way where you can be kind of as most helpful to Labour. So remember, at the moment, Labour still have a relatively small team. They don't have the civil service. They obviously, if they get into government, they will, and there'll be that kind of period of transition. But they've got a relatively small team of advisors who are trying to work out kind of the intricacies of policy. We know kind of what the big picture is going to be. I don't think we'll see many surprises in terms of the energy world, in terms of what will be announced. I think it'll be mainly around kind of targets and Great British Energy. But what we don't know is the detail of everything. So kind of that is what I would say kind of to people on this call, like, think about the detail. What is it that you need as a business to kind of be successful, and kind of get out and tell that story to Labour and kind of to the other political parties, and really make your case on kind of the real kind of fine margins of policy, really, whether it's to speed up planning, whether it's about kind of environmental permitting, whatever it is, kind of be really clear on what it is you need, and crucially, kind of why that helps Labour achieve what they want to achieve. And if you can kind of show that what you want kind of helps Labour achieve what they want, you're likely to have kind of a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's that summing up, isn't it, of sort of do it in one page, like in as few words as possible. How would your project help Labour or the government, whatever it is, achieve what they need to achieve? You've got to sum it up as succinctly as possible, don't we, to make it easier for them, because I think they'll have a lot of people offering them solutions for various things. We don't have any more questions in, so thank you very much for everybody's time. Thank you in particular to the panelists for a really interesting discussion. This is the start of our, as I said, the RSK Power On series about how to comprehensively scope solar NSIPs. So we'll be sharing some details in the chat here and via email about how you can register and find out more about those future events. If you do have any questions for us, we'll send out a follow-up email to this as well. So any particular questions about political side of things, copper in particular can help with that. There'll be, the next webinar is on Tuesday, 4th of June. So that's about Labour prospective parliamentary candidates. That's a webinar that's going to be run by Patrick. So yeah, we'll send out an email, but do get in touch. Email us if you've got any follow-up questions, anything in particular you'd like to follow up on. Otherwise, thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us today.